Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we explore the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and of course our general joy of being alive. And we always have to talk about sustainable design as well. And today we're going to talk about a building owner that manages a whole lot of buildings in a very complex place. I want to introduce you to Thierry Paret. Thierry is the Vice President of Engineering, Architecture, and Maintenance with the New York City School Construction Authority. Did I get that right, Thierry?
Yeah, you got it right. Only the last part were design management, but we touch everything. Yeah.
That's a lot.
Anything related to design is us, yes.
Wonderful. So look, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. It took some trouble. We had some technical difficulties the last time we attempted to record this episode, but they're fixed now. And thank you so much for your patience and your willingness to come back and try again, Thierry.
Thank you, Joe. Great. And thank you for having me and for hosting the New York City School Construction Authority. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, so let's start by learning a little bit about you. Tell us why you became an architect, and then tell us about your background and specifically the path that led you to this role with the School Construction Authority.
And that's a good question. Well, my background is a little bit all over the place, but one thing for sure, when I was a child, I always drew. So I had my pencils, markers, little paint set, and for me, the love of art was probably the main driver. And I was also a bit of a dreamer. So, I would draw these scenes from these hypothetical cities and people, and I used to love to draw cars as well. So all of this, I think, led me down that path. I think there was some family influence as well in terms of going into this profession. One of my mother's first cousins was an architect, actually in Haiti. Came to the U.S. He practiced architecture for a number of years, first with Skidmore, Owing Merrill, way back in the 60s, and then later on, actually, where I am right now at the New York City School Construction Authority, way back, there's no overlap whatsoever. And then if you go further beyond that, or further back on my father's side, paternal side, my uncle's father-in-law was an architect named Georges Beauchamp. So Georges Beauchamp went to l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and was the architect who designed, who actually won the competition and designed the presidential palace in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, which was demolished or destroyed in the earthquake. So there is that part, and my generation, there are other architects. The generation that follows me, there are a few architects as well in the US. And so I think maybe it's in the DNA to be in that field. So I think, that certainly took me down that track or path. And I think also my childhood was pretty varied. As I mentioned, my father was a doctor with the World Health Organization. Both my father and mother were from Haiti. Due to political reasons in the early 60s, he decided to leave. Partially because two of his brothers one of them was the chief of police of Port-au-Prince, and the other one was a colonel in the Haitian army, and he controlled a pretty large piece of the military. And so there were two parades at a time when Papa Doc Duvalier was the president of Haiti, and my father thought maybe it's a good idea to head out of town. And so WHO came around in the early 60s. That's when there was a big movement of independence in Africa. And the opportunity came up for my dad to go to what at that time was the recently independent Belgian Congo, which later would become Zaire, and today is known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so I happened to be born in Kinshasa, well into his, the time frame that he worked in the Congo. So, a big part of the architecture that I grew up around, people think about, what does the architecture. But again, this is the colonial architecture, Belgian architecture that was prevalent also in cities like Kinshasa, which used to be called Leopoldville, named after King Leopold of Belgium. And a lot of the architecture was very much Bauhaus-derived architecture. So these white buildings with this very clean sense of aesthetics. And so I grew up in one of those buildings, and all the buildings around, the commercial buildings and so forth, had that kind of architectural vernacular. And that impressed upon me a certain sense of aesthetics till today that I'm rather fond of. And so that kind of led me to, into the architect that I am today. Now, in terms of how I ended up coming to the SCA, that's a bit of a longer story. Due to my childhood and even in my adult life, some of my life experiences, I consider myself to be an international or global citizen. So, as I mentioned, when I reached the age of 10, we actually moved to New York. My father felt it was time to move to the United States because obviously we're expats. As an expat, eventually you have to go back to a place that may become home, right? And Haiti was still not really an option. So, yeah, the few options was the US, Canada, maybe France. But when he left Haiti, fortunate enough, he ensured that we had green cards. So, we could eventually relocate here. So we moved to New York City. I have to say, it was not exactly love at first sight when I came, even though I used to come here as a child every year. We would come back to the US in summer and go to Montreal after, and then maybe go to Haiti. But it was very different from my childhood, with boisterous city activity all the time. And it was a bit overwhelming. But we were there, and that's where I was going to grow up. So I finished up grammar school in New York, went to high school, eventually attended and graduated from Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, which has a pretty solid school of architecture. And I practiced architecture, went for my internships here in New York. About 4 or 5 years later, I took my New York State license registration exam, the ARE exam. And then shortly thereafter, I was offered a position working for a developer in Las Vegas, Nevada. And it was almost accidental. I went to visit a friend, but I knew someone else who was there who owned a development company. Long story short, I met with him for dinner. A few weeks later, he invites me to come back for an interview. And before I know it, I'm moving to Viva Las Vegas, right? And so I had a fiance at that time, and she came with me to Vegas, and I started as a contracts manager. Eventually, that contracts position turned into being the head of architecture, and we did a lot of this Andalusian style, residential tract homes, low-rise apartment buildings, and so forth. And that was my first taste of really being a manager and having people reporting to me and being responsible for a reasonable amount of construction dollars, right? After about 4 years, I got to a point where, the work became very boring. And I also have been traveling extensively to Europe, particularly to the Republic of Ireland. My ex-wife is from the Republic of Ireland. And I started interviewing, actually first started to build a house, so I built my house there. And I went back and forth. And eventually I went for a few interviews, and a large Irish, big engineering, small architecture firm made me an offer. Their area of practice was mostly pharmaceutical and life sciences. And so they hired me as the head of architecture for their southern office and Cork, Ireland, the southwest corner. And so we moved. We left the United States, moved there. Within about a year, I got my Irish architectural registration, and shortly thereafter, I got my British one because we used to also do work in the United Kingdom. And so my European experience started there, and I worked there for about 10, 11 years until the end of the Celtic Tiger. The Irish economy kind of spurted out like it did in the rest of, it first happened in the US, and then the domino effect. And then when you're in a country with a population of 3.5, 4 million people, the economy comes to a halt very quickly. And of course, architects, engineers, construction, we're the first ones to take the hit, right?
Right.
And so I started, unfortunately, having to let people go from the practice because project after project was on hold. And one of the gentlemen that worked for me actually had worked in Dubai and the UAE and told me, have you ever considered that? Because you could kind of see the writing on the wall. So long story short, I applied to a US firm in Abu Dhabi, and I'm hired. And then what was supposed to have been 2 or 3 years, and the UAE ended up 10 years. That included not just Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but included Doha, Qatar, and finally around in Saudi Arabia and Jeddah, being the campus architect for a large research institute in Saudi Arabia called the CAUS. So about 5, 6 years ago, I moved back to the United States, to New York, and I was first hired by a Canadian firm as their initially as a project director and eventually as a practice lead for the New York State practice. So I was managing two offices. And there it was mostly education projects, higher education, some amount of K through 12, life sciences. So that falls into my background because as an architect, the sectors that where I have experience is higher education, life sciences, residential, which most architects have as well, right? And pharmaceutical because of my Irish experience. A lot of my clients back then were J. Johnson, Amgen, Genzyme, all of these kind of companies. And so I was back in New York. It took me a while to acclimate again. I'd been gone for 20 years. So I felt like a tourist until I realized I'm not going back to JFK Airport and I'm not going back anywhere else. I'm here. Right. So, and then at one point, I happened to be sitting in my office. I had won a contract with the New York City School Construction Authority whilst working for the Canadian architectural practice. And the SCA reached out. I thought it was related to one of the projects that we had, but it was not. And the opportunity presented itself. And so I think, it was a combination of hard work over many years, but also right place, right time. There's always the luck factor thrown in there for good measure. And for me, the mission of this organization is important. When I first arrived in New York, I went into fifth grade. It was a public school. And then I went to junior high school. It was a public school. It was schools that were designed at some point way back by this organization. And so, given that this is a city that gave so much back to my family, myself, and allowed me to help me to get to a point where I am professionally and to my successes, it felt as an opportunity to give back and hopefully to give back in a meaningful way. And the CEO of the agency has been super supportive. She believes in the mission statement, and we do a lot of things very well. And now it's a matter of taking it to the next level in terms of design excellence. And that's my mandate more than anything else. I want to ensure that the children in New York City and of course their parents, that the kids have the best built environment or infrastructure that supports their education and ultimately their success down the line. So that's how I came to become head of architecture, engineering, and design management at the SCA.
What makes a home truly extraordinary? Not just how it looks, but how it feels. Solera Reserve transforms daylight into soft, comfortable light, privacy without blinds, beauty without compromise. By day, refined and luminous. By night, an unforgettable glow. Solera Reserve, luxury glass, designed for living. Learn more at advancedglazings.com/Solera Reserve.
That's an amazing story. I can tell by your smile that it was the right decision, Thierry, so congratulations for that. I want to talk about the SCA itself. Let's talk about its mandate. I mean, it seems sort of self-evident, but I'd love to hear your definition. What is the role, the mandate of the School Construction Authority?
Yeah. And well, that's an excellent question. And I mean, if you were to read officially on our website, it's a mission to design and construct safe, attractive, and environmentally sound public schools for children throughout, many communities of New York, right, over 5 boroughs. And so that's a very clear and direct statement. But layered within that, you really have to think about the quality of the buildings, the environment, right, the well-being component, sustainability, resiliency. We are a coastal city. We've had hurricanes that have really damage the infrastructure. A lot has been learned from those. And in response to that, the codes of New York City have also been adjusted over the years. So we built over, a 100-year storm. And so we really think carefully in terms of the environment that these students are going to be exposed to on a daily basis. And the other piece that's very important is, how cost effective we are. We have on paper what seems to be a very large budget. Our capital plan is just about approximately $20.9 billion. So we're in the current capital plan, which is 2025 to 2029. But you have to imagine that we have over 1,500 schools in the portfolio, in the current portfolio, and we still are designing 8 to 12 new schools or annexes every single year. And then in terms of capital improvement projects, we have hundreds going on, including, building envelope, upgrades to libraries, auditoriums, all this kind of good stuff. We have a massive electrification program, taking the existing stock of buildings and converting them to electrification. So how do we balance out that budget to ensure that budget touches all the needs and provides all the needs to all the schools and the 5 boroughs? That's challenging, right? And so we try to be very thoughtful in terms of what projects. For example, if you look at the CIP projects or capital improvement projects, we have 2 independent firms that were hired by the SCA, and they have a constant process of going out to schools, and they make visual observations or reports of the state of the schools. And then we have a grading system, and those that are most need then obviously get addressed first in terms of the roof has to be replaced, or a facade built, brick repointing and window replacements, etc., etc. The other side of it is also the new schools, where because of shifts in demographics, a neighborhood now doesn't have enough schools. So we need to build new schools to support the changes to those neighborhoods. We have rezoning that has recently taken place, let's say in Queens. So where my office here in Long Island City has been rezoned to allow for much more public housing. That means we have to build more schools. There's another part of Queens, Jamaica Queens. Same thing happens. And then on top of that, there is a mandate by the governor of the state of New York for classroom reduction sizes, which essentially is reducing the ratio of students to teachers. And that also drives the creation of new schools. And so it's a careful balancing act. The other departments of major key stakeholders in the SCA, we work closely with the Department of Education. We also carefully look at how to get the most for every dollar that we spend. So we want design excellence, but it's not meant to be extravagant. It's meant to be the outcome of thoughtful, intelligent design. And we do also marry that into standards that we have. We have a significant suite of standards that our consultants and our own in-house design studio also follows. And so that's how we try to balance this. But also another part of it is what we're going to start looking at now is upgrading our standards and guidelines to look at some benchmarking exercises from other parts of the country, learning from other school districts throughout the U.S., and also looking at the international aspect, what's being done elsewhere. So I believe in not working in a silo, but really examining what others are doing and so forth. So as part of a design and excellence, I bring in world-class leading firms. I call it my master series. And these are firms, some of them are from Europe, some of them are from the US, but they've done work not just domestically or locally in New York, but nationally and internationally. And there are quite a bit of lessons learned that we can look at incorporating from that perspective. So, and also technology changes, products, materials. There's so much that has changed, and practice has become so much more complex. And we're also aware of so much more in terms of what the user experience is. And the old days, they used to think that a classroom was it's the teacher's desk at the front. There's a blackboard. Let's not have any distractions whatsoever. The kids need to be laser focused on what's happening there. The idea of natural light didn't matter. Any kind of views was discouraged because that was a distraction. And now we know that's not the case. And you take a page out of higher education. On the contrary, socialization is important, both for the educators and for the students. And so the way I think about it is that we would like to have some of the lessons learned from higher education, so have those trickle down to a K through 12 space. And I think that's really important. We might as well start giving them a preview of assuming that they go to university, what they're going to encounter. There should not be such a huge gap between high school and university level, right? And so we're going to explore that. Obviously, there are always pressures because in New York City, as you can imagine, the land is increasingly difficult to find. Usually it's smaller than we want. We try to limit the number of stories. We don't like to have more than 5 floors, ideally. Not to say there haven't been some schools that we've had to come up with some innovative ways of designing them. But there is significant pressure in terms of land acquisition and then making the program requirements work within that very finite space, right? And so, yeah, it is about designing, safe, first and foremost, good design. I redefine it as now as design excellence. Safety is a major factor, and then obviously sustainability and environmental resiliency are all part of the equation. And so there is a hierarchy of importance, of course, and so certainly safety is first and foremost. We want to make sure that the kids are safe in the learning environment, but it should be a great experience as well, because who knows, the next architects might come from that environment, and maybe if they are exposed to a building that inspires them, that helps. But never mind the architect piece, the environment should be stimulating. It should be a place where they want to go to. And I think that piece is what I think about. I mean, if I'd like to think that the new schools that we're putting out there, if I was a kid, I would want to go there, and so that's my mission. And I'm thankful that my CEO also supports that mission as well. So, and maybe, I don't know, just to expand upon that, to give you a sense of a design piece, the way my group, architecture and engineering, is structured, I have three main studios. One of them is the in-house design studio. I have about 200 architects, engineers, project managers, and administrative staff. So that's a full-blown architectural practice, right? And they're responsible for designing 40% of that $20.9 billion.
40%, you said?
40%,
okay.
Yeah. So they typically design 2 to 3 of the new schools from scratch, all the way through. And then they do a lot of the building envelope work. They do electrification and projects of that type. And so that's that group. Then I have another studio called the Design Consultant Management Studio, and they manage external firms. And so we hold and manage contracts for architectural firms, MEP engineering firms, landscape architecture firms as well. So we have 4 main framework agreements, they're 3-year contracts, and we assign work to the firms. When it comes to the new schools, we have a process called a mini RFP, which is essentially a design competition. So 3 firms get invited, and then they have to fight it out to demonstrate that the design is, in keeping with the program requirements, taking into account that particular site with all the challenges that it has. And within 2 weeks, they have to turn around a design for us to judge and review. And based on set criteria, they are either awarded or not. And so, so it's no 2 days are alike here. Let's put it that way.
No doubt. So do you have any sort of, criteria or certifications or anything that you follow to help guide you towards sustainable, healthy, resilient buildings?
Yeah, we do. So we have our own green building guide. It was developed by the SCA many years ago. I can take no credit for it, precedes me. But it's based on the U.S. Green Building Council, but it's customized for schools. And I think at the time that it was created, USGBC was in its earlier nascent stages. So just like in other parts of the world where, in the Middle East, they have their own versions of USGBC. Qatar created their own, as an example. Dubai created their own as well, and so on and so forth. So in our case, we create our own, and which essentially is the equivalent of LEED certified, not silver, not gold, not platinum. However, so that criteria is set in there. Also, you have to figure that there are a lot of local laws in New York City that have been put in place. There are law, there are requirements. Those have also informed our green design guide and our standards and guidelines. So we do have a minimum threshold in terms of what is mandated by law we follow. And in some other instances, what we do try to do, there are some projects where we try to push the envelope a little bit, right? And sometimes we call these pilots, and we'll say, okay, we want to try this component of green design on a particular project. And again, long before I joined the SCA, back in 2015, there was a school called the Kathleen Grimm School for Leadership and Sustainability out in Staten Island.
Yep.
Designed by Skidmore, Oren, and Mel. And
we were involved with that project, believe it or not.
Oh, you were? Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
So
we did some of the daylighting.
I mean, and a great project. Within the first few weeks of being here, I went to visit with a team that managed the project. And that was essentially one of those pilot projects by the SCA. First net zero school and an amazing project. I mean, you're familiar with it.
Yep.
In terms of natural light, photovoltaic panels, roof on the facade as well, geo-exchange heating and cooling system. I mean, it had all the bells and whistles and so forth. And that was a test bed, right? Since then, believe it or not, we have not done another one, except that right now we're completing the design for another school, which I'm really excited about. It's called St. John Villa. The name will change. We bought the site in Staten Island again from the New York Archdiocese, and we are doing the adaptive reuse to an existing chapel. That's going to be a STEM center. And then we have two large new buildings, a high school / intermediate school and a public school / intermediate school there, plus an American football field. A significant public realm piece because it has all kind of topography and so forth. But that project also is using geothermal technology. We have photovoltaic panels. Whilst it may not become a net zero project, I think it will get rather close to doing so. It looks much more conventional. It is contemporary, clean, elegant, but not as science fiction-y as the Grimm School was in terms of, the aesthetics. So maybe slightly more acceptable to the public, who I actually quite love the Grimm School, but, I'm an architect and we're kind of wired differently. But yeah, I mean, we are also always exploring other aspects. So right now, one of the conversations we're having is regarding mass timber. There have been a lot of advances. So we visited a school out in Long Island, not one of ours, obviously, to see how they did it. Some of the challenges that they faced in terms of the product itself, supply chain, the contractors knowing how to come up with, and this case, it was not a pure mass timber, it was a hybrid system. So you have a lot of very different bespoke details between steel and timber and so forth, what trades do what and so forth. So we have been doing our research. We have prepared some studies in the past. We're looking at updating one of these studies right now so that we can maybe look at testing this out on one of our upcoming projects. Of course, it can't be too large of a project. We are risk adverse. We don't want people experimenting on our dime. So we're very thoughtful in terms of, the scale of the work and also ensuring that the experience of the design team taking this on. We want to make sure that they've done it somewhere else before prior to trying that out with us. So that's one area that we've looked at. We've also looked at energy piles, which is a different kind of geothermal. So basically the loop is actually in the substructure and the piles. It's embedded into it. It doesn't go quite as deep, but you can perhaps use that and a zero lot line where I don't have a lot of land. So underneath the structure, I'm going to have, and that can provide you with 50 to 60% of your heating and cooling. Not all of it, so you do have a more traditional system balancing it out, but we're looking at that as well. So we are always seeking sustainable, options or sustainable strategies to ensure that our buildings are greener. And then there are low-hanging fruit. Obviously, natural light means that you're using less electricity to provide lighting within the building, right? Buildings that are well insulated and airtight. That's another important part of it. And so we look at incorporating this across the entire portfolio of new buildings. And then, as I mentioned, there are a number of local laws that are in place in New York City, and we follow them to the letter. And but going above and beyond is always something that we are looking to do. And sometimes we do little pilots. And some project, for example, now we're looking at rain screen systems that double as PVs. We want to make sure that they work first prior to. So we'll do, basically kind of mock-ups within the building to see, okay, well, how is this functioning? And so we're prudent, but we certainly are looking to move that needle forward.
Very cool. So, all right, so let's talk about sort of the broader social aspects, that inevitably come into your role: environmental justice, equity challenges, underserved neighborhoods. How do you incorporate those needs into your sort of design? And you'd mentioned determining what your priorities are. Have you got an established process for how you bring those sort of social justice concerns into prioritization and design methodologies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think part of my approach and my thoughts on it, is bringing in the right design talent as well, right? The way I look at it is I want the best schools, I mean, ideally throughout the city, but also in areas that may be the most challenged area, neighborhoods and so forth in New York City. And I think sometimes one building can be a catalyst in terms of changing the DNA, the fabric of that neighborhood, right? Because
Yep.
it shows that we are investing and in a way that is meaningful. So, for example, I mean, they're small gestures, right? But there are many schools in the past where we would have bars on the ground floor, on the first floor of the building. I think personally that's not a great way of communicating with those who live in the neighborhood. We are a guest in their neighborhood. We are designing and building a new school for their children. I do not want to see bars on any schools. Now, if you want to have safety and so forth, yes, you can put hurricane glass, so it's more impact resistant and so forth. But the school should embrace the neighborhood. It shouldn't be this jewel that, we're worried about. That's not who we are. That's not who we want to be. We want to be part of a community. And that's a small gesture. But when going deeper into this point, it's really about finding the right talent. So part of my outreach has been, we're fortunate, we're in New York City. We have some tremendous designers who know how to design within a budget, but, but who design in a sensitive manner and an intelligent manner. And so that has been a big part of it. And we're starting to see the fruits of our labors right now with some of the designs that have been completed. Some of these buildings are starting to come out of the ground. And the way that we look at this is we want to ensure that it's thoughtful design that has a positive impact on students, the faculty, as I mentioned, the communities, and that focus on well-being, safety, and accessibility. So, for example, for accessibility, we have a path of travel projects, right? And these are sometimes very complex because what it does is it takes an existing building and ensures that it is fully compliant, ADA compliant. So the addition of ramps, and if there are no elevators, we add elevators. The restrooms to ensure that those are ADA compliant, and across all areas so that someone who has some form of disability is able to use that facility fully, including teachers, right? And other faculty members. So we have a massive program for that. And these are, on paper, they sound simple, but they're very complex and challenging when you're dealing with an existing building. Particularly when you look at some of the older buildings that we have, the grand old schools from the early 1900s, they're all our landmark buildings, and we intend to keep them because they are some of the most beautiful buildings you could imagine. Sometimes people don't even realize it's a school. It looks like it could be a courthouse from that period. They are absolutely gorgeous, and we want to maintain their integrity. So it requires a sensitive hand in terms of designing it properly. The other part is just ensuring that we integrate sustainable and innovative architectural practices, right? Architects that work well, first of all, with us, but also with their specialist consultants to make sure that we incorporate critical parts or pieces of sustainability. Inspiring and engaging spaces, right? We want kids to be stimulated, not overstimulated, but stimulated, and that fosters learning. And buildings that support the educational mission, addressing community needs. If the school is used by the community, let's make sure that it's easily accessible to them so that if they have events and so forth, they can hold it. And what is, should be the heart of that neighborhood. Environmental responsibility is without doubt. We make sure that existing schools, if there are any environmental issues, that we clean that up properly and that the buildings are safe in terms of health. Indoor air quality is a big piece, right? And that's something that we're focusing on as well. And because we do not know where the pedagogy, where education is going, we should design in a way that provides a certain level of adaptability, flexibility down the line. Learning is changing. We have the advent of AI right now. We really don't know what kind of careers kids in the future are going to have. And I think everyone right now is playing catch up in all industries, right? And I think education is probably challenged as well. They don't know how we're going to teach these kids in 15, 20, 30 years. And so it's contingent upon us to ensure that these schools are able to adapt to whatever the New York State Department of Education is going to follow in terms of the teaching methods and so forth. But I think, and again, I mean, you look at green roofs, and we have a program where we're starting to incorporate green roofs. The Department of Environmental Protection obviously has a requirement in terms of managing stormwater and so forth. So all our new buildings are taking that into consideration. So the real estate and the roof is PVs versus green roof, and we're looking at ways to combine the two, so that we're getting the best of both worlds. But we're addressing the needs of the school system in a balanced manner. But I think a lot of it also has to do with the expertise of those who are designing with us, with the next round of updates to our standards to ensure that the baseline is consistent in terms of what design consultants have to follow, and minimum designs or standards that they have to implement or incorporate into their design. So that's how we're addressing it. It's a challenge. I mean, without a doubt, it's a challenge. But I'd like to continue to think that every school reflects the history of the neighborhood. I expect designers to do their research. And every school, we don't want cookie cutters. We want buildings that have a link to the history of a neighborhood or a certain aspect. That, I don't want cookie cutter helicopter buildings and I don't know where I am. I want them to have their own identity, but to do it in a contemporary, clean, elegant way, and to have buildings that look just as current and 20, 30, 40 years as they do the day that they were completed, right? So I don't know if I went too long, but anyways, that's the goal. That's the mission.
I love it. Oh, there's a great answer. Okay, I have to ask you a question, a very personal question, and we are starting to run a little bit long on time, but I want to ask you this question. I want to hear about it. Thierry, you were founding president of AIA Middle East. How did that come to be?
That was one of the interesting ones. So up till that time in my career, I never volunteered for anything. I would just do my job and spend time with my family, and that was it. Mm-hmm. So I was sitting in Abu Dhabi, and I got an email from a gentleman in France, Paris. And he told me, there's a meeting in Dubai, and there are a bunch of architects, American architects. We want to start an American Institute of Architects Middle East chapter. And I looked at this thing and I said, that doesn't sound like me. But then I said, no, why not? So I get in my car, I drive an hour and a half down Sheikh Zayed Road to Dubai, and I meet a whole bunch of people that are my friends till today. So as we met and we talked about, do we need an AIA chapter to support American architects? And so anyways, long story short, I start getting involved and doing bits of work and so forth, and I get elected as the first president of the AIA Middle East chapter. That included all the Gulf states going all the way through Maghreb, North Africa, and so forth. And so I served for the first 2 years. I wrote the bylaws for it, helped to get it registered as a nonprofit, which was a bit challenging within our host country. And so that just kept on leading from one thing to the next. And then after that, they decided to start an AI international region, which was for everything outside the US. And we already had chapters in France and the UK and continental Europe, the UK, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo. There are AIA chapters there, right? And, in Japan. And so we wanted to fill the gaps in between those kind of areas where we had no representation. And so I was one of the founders there. So I was initially the treasurer and then eventually became, I think, was the fourth president of that group. And then at the same time, the gentleman who had reached out to me got me to run for office on the national board of the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C. And so there are three levels: the main board for AIA National, you have the regions, and then you have the local chapters. So now all of a sudden I'm one of the 6 directors on the national board responsible for 100,000 members, right? And then I serve on a lot of task force and so forth. And to be honest, I think that's been a tremendously rewarding part of it. Some of it from a selfish perspective, I've met absolutely brilliant people there. I've learned a lot from that. It has informed my way of thinking as an architect. It has allowed me to meet architects from every corner of the planet. When I was president of AIA International, as an example, I had held 2 international conferences, 3-day conferences, One was in Singapore, the other one was in Shanghai. And these were epic. I mean, you have people flying from all over the world. You have the American ambassador coming from Beijing down to Shanghai to attend, the head of the Chinese Association of Architects coming. We invited them because we always try to work in a collaborative manner. It's always learning from our guests. And I think it has been, yeah, I think one of the highlights of my career. And I always tell young architects or students, volunteering is really important. It's about the human connections, but also giving back and passing it on to those who come after us, right? And so that was, for me, yeah, one of the highlights, and it really helped to form who I am as a person and as an architect.
Manage the connection between building occupants and the outside world using Solera translucent glass. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. I love it. All right. I'm at the point where I ask my $1 million question. I ask a question, the same question at the end of every show, Thierry. And I say to my guests, answer it from whatever perspective you'd like. So here's the question. What makes a great building?
That's a good one. I've been asked that question a few times. And so I would say it's a building that is meaningful, enduring, and has an inspiring environment. You know, it transcends functionality. It's just not a box with punch holes for windows, and you call it a day. You know, it balances aesthetics, utility. Obviously, it's sustainable. It has a cultural resonance in terms of addressing where it's located. So, as I mentioned earlier, no building should be helicoptered and to a site, right? You need to learn about that culture, the environment. So, when I was in Ireland, I designed in a contemporary manner, but I put my Irish hat on. When I was in the UAE, I designed as if I were an Emirati, not an American living in the Middle East or an American living in Ireland. And I think that's what makes a great building. It is, contextually, it resonates with the culture, with site conditions, obviously sustainability. There are a lot of drivers, but it's not pastiche. You're not trying to recreate history. It is of that time. It's like, I'm not going to go buy a Ford Model T. I want a Tesla or some electric car, whatever it is. I don't want something from back then, right? I may want to have something in my collection, but I don't necessarily want to live like, my great grandparents lived, or have something that looks like that. I think that's disingenuous. But yeah, it considers climate, and obviously it's equitable, it's accessible, it's human-centered, it's about the person. It's not about making the person feel small or insignificant. It's about making the person, you want them to feel well, their well-being. And of course, that takes into account technology, materiality. Technology has changed. We don't build the same way that we used to 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It should look at the best practice of today. And of course, it needs to be cost effective. It cannot be some ostentatious, palace or ego-driven building. It has to be a building that everyone uses, everyone loves. And yeah, I think that, to me, that's what a great building is.
How wonderful. Very thorough answer. I love it. Are there any events coming up or any big news that you'd like to share before we go?
I'm glad that you asked that question. We are currently organizing a design excellence and networking forum. So this is the New York City School Construction Authority. We're going to hold that at the high school called Frank Sinatra High School, right here in Astoria, Queens. We are going to invite 2 keynote speakers, and the focus is going to be on redefining part of our mission statement, which is the design excellence piece. We'll have Michael Bishop from Paycop Free, the IMP's old office, and he's the design partner for that firm, and he's the gentleman who's designing our new campus in Staten Island, St. John Villa, and he's going to talk through how the process that we went through in terms of designing this building, while still taking into consideration our standards, but just demonstrating what high quality design is to the industry. We're going to be inviting other architects and engineers, those who currently work for us, those who have recently won contracts but haven't designed anything yet, and the prospective consultants that will hopefully find interest in working with our agency down the line. So Michael Bishop will have a session, and then there's another gentleman named Jean-Claude Brizard. And Jean-Claude Brizard is an educator. He started off with Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation, and now leads his own organization. And he actually develops educational programs nationally and internationally. And he has been a keynote speaker at EdSpaces and A4LE and so forth. And he's going to speak about the importance of the built infrastructure that as it supports education. And he's a magnificent speaker. And I think it would be good to provide those two perspectives, the educator and the design architect as part of it. So that's part of it. And the rest of it is going to be networking, doing business with the SEA and so on and so forth. So that's going to happen on February 18th in New York City from 8 to approximately 3 p.m. So we'll throw that out there.
Oh, fantastic. Thierry, what a wonderful conversation, and there's so much good information in there. I can't thank you enough, and I have to admit I'm absolutely amazed. Your ability to run such a complicated organization. My hat's off to you. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Thank you so much for having me, and really, let's definitely keep in touch, and sure. We'll give you an update as to where we are in a few years. But thank you very much for having the opportunity to speak on your show today. So,
of course. You take care.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.